All right, so Kevin, so I guess like people who don't know who you are, can you just give us a bit of a background of who you are and where you're from, etc.?
Yeah, I would say in the grand scheme of things, I am an absolute nobody who in my little corner of the world is trying to do a lot of really amazing things. So I'm Kevin Palmieri. I am the founder and the host of Next Level University. We're a podcast that is coming up on 2,000 episodes. We have been doing this full time since 2018, and this is my baby. I am somebody who needed self-improvement in my life drastically, and then I went all in on self-improvement, and then we started teaching other people self-improvement. And most of it came from massive pain. A lot of people say, "Why'd you go all in on your dreams?" Massive pain is the
Yeah.
answer, and unfortunately I feel like that's kind of the necessity that I needed, and I think a lot of people end up needing to go all in on something.
Yeah, so I guess something you've been known to say when I was doing a bit of research into you was that you found that rock bottom had a sort of a basement, as you put it. So, what does rock bottom look like, and how do you climb out of a place like that?
For me, rock bottom was having all of the external things you could ever want. So when I was 25, 26, my girlfriend at the time was a model. I had a six-figure income. I had my dream car. I had a new apartment, and I was getting ready to compete in a bodybuilding show. So I was quite literally in the best shape I will ever be in. It's never going to be as close. But internally, Adam, I was miserable. And I fell into the trap that I think a lot of us fall into of assuming accumulation of external results will equate to fulfillment of internal self. And that just was not the experience that I had. So my girlfriend left. I was dealing with a lot of mental health struggles after my bodybuilding show. Work got slow and I was struggling financially. And I managed to overcome all of that. I managed to go on and make even more money than I'd ever made before. And then my mental health was just in such a rough place where I was sitting on the edge of a bed the next year contemplating suicide.
Right.
I know a lot of people, well, you had the things, you had the success, and that's not what success really is to me. And it took me
So,
finding that to realize it. Go ahead.
so obviously you have those things. You had all X, Y, Z. You had the pretty girl, the money, the car. So, what was it that was missing then?
I would say fulfillment. I think there's a drastic difference between happiness and fulfillment. I think happiness is results based. If this interview, if this conversation goes well, I will be happy. If you like me, I will be happy. If your audience likes me, I will be happy. In a way, no matter the outcome, I am fulfilled in the process of adding value. I think there's a big difference between those two. So
Do you think that obviously you're talking about fulfillment, but then you're talking about a lot about external things? They're like obviously rewards from the external environment. What do other people think? What can I achieve? Do you think that sometimes fulfillment comes from the self?
I think it always comes from the self. Yeah.
So how do you think those two link? How do you think those two things link then? Like, obviously you're saying that fulfillment comes from the self, but then you also need those external things in order to fulfill that self.
I think fulfillment comes from growth and contribution,
Right. Okay.
growing and contributing towards something that you might never get. I don't know if I'm ever going to get an award that says I'm the most successful podcaster in terms of adding value into people's lives. They don't make awards for that. So I'm probably never going to actually accomplish the goal, but the journey of becoming the type of person capable of accomplishing that is super fulfilling. So I think it's more of a fulfillment is you trying to maximize your potential in your own unique way, where happiness is just dopamine. It's just, if I eat a donut, I'm going to be happy,
Yeah.
but I'm not necessarily going to be fulfilled. I kind of know this isn't what's best for me. And those are two very, very different lines from what I've experienced.
Yeah. So I guess what are the first steps someone would take if they found themselves in the space that you were in, that sort of that rock bottom? What are the first few steps that someone can start taking to get themselves out of a place like that?
Sit down and write out, so make 3 columns on a piece of paper, write out your core values, write out your core beliefs, and then write out your core aspirations. And then we have to figure out, well, are any of those in conflict right now? Because what I found, and I was guilty of this, my core values were freedom, certainty, and kind of flexibility in my life. what I traded in were all three of those things for the aspiration of making as much money as possible. So I
Mm.
was feeding one thing while I was bleeding a bunch of other places in my life, and it just became unsustainable over time. So if you sit down and you figure out, okay, my core value is family. My core belief is I want to be the best parent I can possibly be. But one of my core goals is to be X amount of financial success. That's currently constricting me because I'm not doing the other things. You're probably going to feel stuck. And one of the best ways to put it is you're going to feel misaligned. Misalignment, I think, is another word for stuck, except you might be moving. It just doesn't feel like you're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, it might not be so extreme.
Yeah. Yeah. You might
Yeah.
not wake up and say, I feel stuck. You might say, I feel off. Things don't feel right. Yeah, it depends on the person, but usually it's I feel off.
So you need to make sure that those sort of three columns are all in sort of a healthy balance. So what was out of balance for you personally?
I I traded in so many things for the money. So the job that I had required a lot of travel. So the year I made the most money, I spent 10 months living on the road. Every single week I was living in hotels, driving 6 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours to job sites. I gave up all of my certainty. I didn't know where I was working until the Sunday before we left, pretty often. I gave up pretty much all possibility of having a love life because I was just never home. And love and connection was something that was deeply meaningful to me. I gave up all my freedom. I had to be at a place at a certain time and I was stuck there for a week or a month at a time. So that was really the issue for me is I gave up all of that because the money seemed like, yeah, whatever. It'll make up for these things that I'm not getting and these needs that I'm not getting met. And
Mm.
I it's really hard to know that in the process because honestly, the money did matter to me more.
So it kind of blinded you a little bit. Do you ever think that there can be enough money where it can completely mask what the feelings that you felt? So it can mask those values not being met, the aspirations not being met, etc. Do you think there is a price on it? Or do you think it'll catch up with everyone?
No, I think if we look at, and again, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor, so I'm a podcaster who didn't go to college. So take this with a grain of salt. If we look at some of the most successful people on the planet who ultimately end up taking their lives, there is a reason that that happened. And my guess, if I'm venturing a guess, it would be two things. One, they assumed that accumulation of all of the external stuff would fix the internal voids,
Mm.
or it gets to a place where people love you so much more than you love yourself, and their idea of who you are is so much greater than you feel, and it becomes this thing that breaks you internally. So no, I don't think you can ever run from that internal stuff because it's always with you. That's why the inner work is so valuable because that's really the only way. Again, in my opinion, that's the only way to get rid of it.
Yeah. Would you say that it, like obviously looking back on it retrospectively, would you say that hitting rock bottom is a necessity for someone in order to achieve their maximal potential?
No, and it's I'm not fully fleshed out on this yet, but no, because I know people who have had maybe much less, we'll say it seems like much less trauma that went in a very different direction and they kind of ran their lives off the tracks. I also know other people who have been through way, 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 way more than I have who turned their lives around and did something amazing. I think your response to it is more important than the amount that you go through
Mm.
because that matters. And then there's also the survivor's bias of, yeah, we see people who make it, who hit rock bottom, but for every person who made it that hit rock bottom, there's probably 10 that didn't. They probably
Mm.
didn't make it. So no, I don't think it's a necessity. I think it's been sexualized. I think it's like really sexy to have that kind of story. It's like I came from here to here, but I don't
Yeah.
I don't think it's a necessity. I think it helps if you know how to use it, but there's also a lot of stuff that because of that rock bottom, I'll be working on for the rest of my life. And that's an important piece of it too.
Like what?
I'm always, I was on a podcast one time and they said, "Can I ask you a challenging question?" And I said, "Of course." They said, "Do you ever think you'll want to kill yourself again?" And I was like, whoa. Shout out to you for having the courage to ask me that. I appreciate that very much. And I said, honestly, no, but I never thought I would in the first place. So
Yeah.
there's always this fear of, I don't know, what if I get to the place where people think I'm way better than I think I am? How do you get through that? How do you deal with that? I'm way more public than I ever thought I would be. And I have a huge fear of, it's less than it's ever been, but believe it or not, I have a pretty large fear of judgment. So that
Right.
can really play tricks on your mental health. So there's a lot of that. I still have imposter syndrome. I still deal with that pretty much on a daily basis, less than ever, but less than ever mixed with bigger opportunities doesn't feel less than ever. It feels the same, if not more. So that's something I still work through. So a lot of that stuff's still there. I just coexist with it differently, I would say.
How would you coexist? So that kind of leads on to my next question. So you mentioned imposter syndrome, or you mentioned sort of from that question, if you started to sway back towards that sort of dark path, what are some things that you would do to keep on top of that, or to battle this imposter syndrome, as you put it?
I always go and look at the past. So the beautiful thing about having so many episodes is I can go back and look at where I was 4 years ago. And I always go back and I look to see how far I've come. And I try to get the perspective of that Kev 4 years ago thought he knew a ton. He didn't know anything. This Kev today doesn't feel like he knows anything, but he knows way more than 4 year ago Kev did. So there's something to that. So I always try to find something that grounds me. I think that's probably the best way to put it. And it usually, so if I'm getting ready to do something that's way outside of my comfort zone, I ask myself, what's the most recent and relevant proof that proves to me that I can actually do the thing that I'm afraid of?
Yeah.
That is always super helpful for me. And luckily I've done enough things where I have enough proof, but it's usually reflecting, grounding, and then just making myself prove to myself that I'm actually capable. What do you do? What do you do for imposter syndrome?
Kind of similar, like obviously I watch a lot of people, influential people, and what you just said kind of reminds me of something. I assume you know who David Goggins is, obviously being a Yankee, and he says have a stack of undeniable proof that you are who you say you are, and that's exactly what you're talking about in terms of like whenever I'm navigating through life. You always have that doubt of like, oh, can I take the next step? Can I start the podcast? Can I pursue whatever I want to pursue? And then you like sort of look back and think, well, can I actually do this? But then if you're always making sure you're doing hard things, then you always have that confirmation that, well, I've done this in the past. I've done hard things in the past. So hard things they don't become harder. You just become stronger and better at doing them. So it's like you're saying, you almost build an evidence stack to say, well, I've done X, Y, Z in the past, so why not take that next step and do this? So it's like you said, it's all about having that sort of evidence there.
Yeah. And it's like trying to go against the conditioning. So if your conditioning is not good enough, not smart enough, not competent enough, you're probably going to deal with imposter syndrome more than somebody who doesn't have that. I just know that my mind is playing tricks on me. That's all it is. Like, Kev, I know you feel not good enough in this moment, but you felt not good enough pretty much before everything you've done. And 99 times out of 100, it goes better than you think. So let's just see what happens. And
yeah, do you ever get that where you sort of think, when maybe you don't have those feelings of, oh, maybe I'm not good enough, and you sort of feel more uncomfortable when you don't have those feelings than when you do?
I will tell you, most of the losses, the big L's that I have taken have come from arrogance. And it's me going in saying last time went really well, so I shouldn't even stress it. There's something called, have you ever heard of Jim Collins?
Jim Collins, yeah, I've heard of him. I've not studied him probably as much as you, but I have heard of him.
He's got a lot of really good books about business, and one of the things he talks about is productive paranoia. So
What is that?
productive paranoia is having somebody, or having it within yourself, where you're always thinking about what could possibly go wrong, but you're using that in a productive manner, not stopping you from doing things.
Yeah.
So a healthy amount of paranoia.
Yes. Yeah. When I lose productive paranoia, things can go off the tracks, because one of the things I do with anxiety is I over prep.
Yeah.
But there's worse things to do. So don't lose that. Maybe I don't have to prep for 3 hours. Maybe I can prep for an hour. But it's more the principle of don't forget what got you here. Because the second you forget what got you here, you might not get to stay here anymore.
Yeah, that's definitely something I can relate to. Productive paranoia, in terms of, like, I've always found it very difficult to know when it goes too far. So sometimes you feel like you just said, then I don't like planning too much, because sometimes the more you plan, the worse you execute. I usually am a sort of go with the flow, and the more pressure I feel, that's when I perform best. So I always find it quite hard to find the balance of, right, how much do I plan for this? Is there a healthy amount of production paranoia? But then when are you going too much of, like, you're probably feeling too much of that, to the point where your execution is actually at a detriment than it would have been if you'd just chilled out a little bit, maybe not done as much, thought too much into it, etc. So how do you know where that line is based on the thing that you're executing?
I think it depends on, it's such a challenging question to answer. I think it depends on the thing that you're doing and the competence you have, because I had a really big opportunity last year, in the middle of the year last year. And I was prepping and prepping and prepping and prepping. And eventually it got to the point where I said, Kev, you're at the point now where you're memorizing. And when you memorize, you're not giving yourself credit for all of the work you've done leading up to this.
Yeah.
So I think there's a big difference between being prepared and then relying upon memorization to get you through something, when in reality, you've done the thing long enough where you unconsciously have the answers. And you just gotta trust that. So question for you, what podcaster to podcaster, what kind of prep what did you do for this episode? What kind of prep did you do for this episode?
So obviously, I try not to over prep, because the more I over prep, like the first few podcasts I did, I obviously prepped every question, and I sort of identified what direction it would take. But then obviously I had the plan there, but then as you're executing, it's like, oh, it's not quite going in that direction, and then it's like, well, now I have to improv and all this sort of stuff. So for, obviously, as I've gone on, the more experience I've got, obviously I've not done as much as you, but I've got enough experience now to know, well, have your talking points, but then don't be afraid to go with the flow. Sometimes I've even done podcasts where I've had talking points, I've had questions to ask, and I've just maybe asked 2 or 3, and I've just gone with the flow. So it is very much a case of have ideas, but like you said, rely on yourself, because I think when you were saying a minute ago, when you're over prepping, it becomes robotic. You're not being yourself. You're just regurgitating something that it will come naturally if you just allow it to. Do you know what I mean? Like have a plan, have a go-to, fair enough, but don't look too much into it where it's literally just you're acting. You don't want to be, when you find yourself acting, then that's when I find, in my experience, you put yourself at a detriment. Have a plan and go with the flow.
Well, like we were just talking about, if you prep, let's say you prep for 3 hours and that becomes your guardrails. Next time when you're looking for the most recent and relevant proof, the proof is you have to prep for 3 hours.
Yeah.
And that you can handcuff yourself with your own, I guess, with whatever your approach is. And that's why it's so important to do a little bit more outside of your comfort zone, a little bit more outside of your comfort zone. And then eventually you'll take an L. You'll have an interview where you get off and you say, yeah, that wasn't it. Okay. Next time we just dial it back a little bit. We don't have to go all the way back, right? When you're running and you trip and fall and you crack your head open, you don't say, well, I can't run anymore, I have to go back to crawling. No. Maybe we don't run on rocks. Maybe we don't run at night. Maybe we don't run after we've had a couple pints at the pub. There's a lot. You can go somewhere else instead of going all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah, precisely. Like, rather than cutting your legs out, just draw it back and go from there. No, 100%. So obviously, when you started the whole self-development journey, obviously you delve sort of into the holistic self-development. What is holistic self-development for those that don't know?
Yeah, it's not what you think. So I like fast food and I have a glass of whiskey every once in a while. So I think when a lot of people hear holistic, they think from the earth, organic, natural, that type of stuff. I got nothing against that. Holistic for us means life, love, health and wealth. So I have been somebody who is in very good shape externally, but my mental health was garbage. I was somebody who made really good money, but my relationships were terrible. Eventually, I figured, well, I would like to have all of that. I want to be the healthiest, wealthiest, most in love version of myself because that's when I'm the most fulfilled. Now, it also is probably 3 times as hard because you're doing a lot of different things at the same time. But I also think it's 3 times more fulfilling being deeply in love, really pouring into your physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, and having money to be able to increase your lifestyle and help people that need help.
Is it always possible to have all of those things that you mentioned at an optimal at all times?
No. No, I don't think you can ever have them optimal at the same time. Technically. Because if I'm crushing it at level 10 in finance, that means I can't be crushing something else at level 10. It could be 9.9 or 9.8, but that's like years and years down the line. So I would say, man, I always consider it a juggling act. So I'm with Adam right now. My wife is at work. I am not actively building my relationship right now. I am not being paid to be here. I'm also not spending money, which is good. So I'm not necessarily building the business right now. Right now, I am really focused on improving myself as a podcaster. So yeah, I consider it a juggling act. And can you optimize it better? Yeah. If you have a business with your partner, if you exercise with your partner, okay, that's going to optimize things a little bit differently. But no, I think it can be very dangerous to assume that you're going to be leveling all 3 up in the same speed, in the same direction at the same time. I think I won't say it's impossible, but I think it's way harder than people give credit to.
Thank you so much for watching this video so far. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and comment. And also, if you can hit that subscribe button down there, it helps us out massively. What advice would you have for people who are struggling to even do the juggling, to juggle all them perspectives at once?
Oh, it's going to be a strange answer. Do less, but more focused in all 3 things. So really dial in. What is the number one thing that matters the most in your relationship? Is it quality time? Is it physical touch? Is it fun, unique experiences? What's the number one thing? Okay, cool. Now, what is a habit we can build around that we do every day? That's one. Fitness. Maybe you're like me and you like bodybuilding, but you also like kickboxing and you like jujitsu. You might have to pick one. And that might be the one that you do every day. I've gotten rid of jujitsu and I don't do kickboxing nearly as much as I'd like to, but I do bodybuilding almost every day. And then figuring out what moves the needle most when it comes to money. Obviously, if you have a 9-to-5 or a career, it's a little bit different. But I often think of the less is more when less is more focused when it comes to that. So that's usually my advice on that.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things that people struggle with in terms of, often people think that, there's that old saying, isn't there? You can't have your cake and eat it. So like when you pour out of one cup into another, you have to be willing. You have to know that, when you were doing that something is gonna be at a detriment. No matter what that is. So it's important to sort of have priorities. To have, obviously your health, your family, they come first, and then anything from there is almost a positive. But you have to be willing and understand that there's a consequence to pouring into one rather than trying to pour into everything. And then, it's if you're trying to do too much, then you become a master at nothing.
Chasing 2 rabbits, you catch none.
Yeah.
You gotta chase one. You gotta chase one rabbit. And you might not even catch that one rabbit. Rabbits are quick, but I think that we live in this time where most of the advice that is given is meant to be sexy more than it's meant to be helpful. And one of the things I've been living by this premise for the last few years, if you're somebody who has, let's say, a level 3 self-belief, you're not somebody who believes you're going to conquer the world, you have self-doubt, let's just say level 3 out of 10, set level 4 goals, not level 10 goals. I don't think level 10 goals are going to help you. I think a lot of people say if your goals don't scare you, they're not big enough. I think that's the dumbest thing ever. I do. I think it's the dumbest thing ever. that is usually said by people who have 10 out of 10 self-belief.
Mm.
My business partner, Adam, I've never met a human that has as much self-belief as him. He can do anything. He does not believe anything is impossible for him. And he used to give me advice like that. And I used to say, thank you. I appreciate it. Just believe in myself more. Thanks. That's what I've been trying to do for the last 35 years of my life. I don't know how to do it. It doesn't work the same for me as it does for you. So I started setting smaller goals. And that was something that was super beneficial to me. So I think that it depends. That's why podcasts and book everything is so hard, because it depends on the person listening. Everybody listening has had a different experience, and they should have different goals based on their own self-belief and self-worth. And that's why it's so hard to speak to an audience all at once.
Yeah, and based on their own, obviously everyone has different priorities as well. So it's hard for you to say, well, prioritize, your family. People might not have a family, or might not have a big family or whatever. So yeah, it's very subjective based on the recipient. But what would you say are the 3 most important habits for self-development? If you had to narrow it down to just 3, what would you say? What would the first 3 be?
Learning every day, whatever. Again, I'm not going to say 60 minutes. I'm not going to say 5 hours. Whatever a sustainable amount of reading or listening to an audiobook or watching a YouTube video is for you. For me, it was 15 minutes, and then it was 30 minutes, and it's pretty much stayed at 30 minutes for the last however many years. And I very rarely miss that. That's one of the habits that I have pretty much dialed in. That's one. The thought on that is it will help you internally, but it'll also help you become more competent, which will help you make more money in the long run. So if we're breaking that down to 1, moving your body for 30 minutes every day. Again, I'm a bodybuilder. I like lifting weights. If you want to walk, go for a walk. If you want to swim, you want to play pickleball, whatever, moving your body for 30 minutes a day is going to be wonderful for you. And then probably one that my wife and I do that's been super helpful is every night before we go to bed, we each say one thing that we're grateful for about each other. And it takes all of 2 minutes, and we're way more connected because of that. So you have 1 under health, you have 1 under wealth, and you have 1 under love. I would say those are probably the 3. If you're single and you don't have a relationship, maybe you can put another one into health or another one into wealth, right? And that's the beauty of this is you can customize it to your life and what works best for you.
Yeah, and obviously as you grow older, that will change over time based on the period of life that you're in as well. What have you identified about people obviously you're helping self-develop? What things have you identified that stop most people from improving the self?
Family is a big one. Unfortunately, some of the people that love us the most and that we're supposed to love the most are also the ones that hold us back the most. And it's not always intentional. It's not always from a negative place. Sometimes they just don't want to see you fail. They don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, or you have just been in a relationship with your family for X amount of years and you're that person to them. They don't know you as anybody else other than the person that they see in front of them. That's a big one. I would say the other one is it is very hard to be consistent. Consistency is one of the hardest things in the world. And I think that we unfortunately make it harder on ourselves by going back to what we talked about and just setting really big goals. So you and I are talking right now, it's the 14th of January. I'm willing to bet, and I'm pretty sure the data backs this up.
I already know what you're going to say.
If you're watching or listening, and I'm guessing you probably didn't do this because you're listening to a self-improvement podcast or a podcast that's focused on helping you level up. If you set a massive goal at the beginning of the year for your New Year's resolution, I'm willing to bet there's a giant piece of the population that's not doing it anymore. Unfortunately, we have to focus more on building the habit than getting the results. And that's just a very, very hard thing to deal with. So I think those are 2 of the big ones. Everybody has fear of judgment in some way, shape, or form. That's another thing. And then the last thing I would throw in is I used to think that I was afraid of failure and everybody was afraid of failure. That was like the big thing. Everybody's afraid of failure. There's a lot of people out there that are also afraid of success because every time they succeed, the people around them villainize them. Oh, it must be nice. Oh, you won another award. Oh, you won another race, whatever it is. And a lot of them, unfortunately, end up with the limiting belief of if I do continue to be successful, I will end up alone. And sometimes that is an unfortunate piece of the truth. I don't think it always has to be. But that's
Yeah.
something too. Understanding, are you more afraid of failure than you are success? Are you somebody who feels very competent when it comes to external results, but you don't feel competent when it comes to relationships? That is a
Mm.
very important thing to understand, because the more aware you are of it, the more you can hopefully influence it.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of links to something that I did a lot of reading about in terms of when I was reading about people becoming successful. They often said that you have, like you said about family, they have family around them that often there becomes a resentment there, because basically the way that it's working is you're becoming a different person, and the person that they want that person to stay consistent for the rest of their life. Like, they don't want you to change and for you to go on and perhaps fail, or perhaps end up in a different spot that would detriment the relationship between you and themselves. So that, yeah, it is interesting to see that sometimes that it can be the closest ones to you that hold you back because of that sort of relationship there.
Sad. It's sad. And I understand when I left my job. So I wasn't raised with my dad. I didn't know my dad. I didn't meet my dad until I was 27 with the understanding that he was my dad. I went to my mom and my grandmother and I said, "Hey, I just quit my job and I'm going to do this podcast thing." And I remember my grandmother said, "When are you going to go get another job?" And I said, "No, I'm never going to get another job. Like, I'm going to either die or I'm going to be successful at this." And every time I would go see her, she'd be like, "Hey, have you looked for any jobs recently? Have you?" No, no, no. I'm serious. I'm never going to get another job. But
Mm.
when things got rough and I would go over there and say, "Yeah, my car broke down and I can't get it fixed," or "My car is stalling at red lights like a scene from a cartoon. It just shuts off. It's terrible." I know that there was a piece of them that wanted to save me of all the suffering and all the embarrassment and whatever I was going through. Honestly, completely understandable. So it's not always, "Adam, I don't want to see you succeed." I don't think it usually is that. I think it's usually, "I don't want to see you leave me. I don't
Mm.
want you to become something that maybe one day you wake up and realize I wasn't super supportive, or maybe I'm not what's best for you." One of the most valuable things I've learned over this journey, and Tony Robbins has a TED Talk where he talks about the 6 basic human needs. Best TED Talk ever. It's a great TED Talk. Everybody is just trying to get their needs met. That's it. At the end of the day, everybody is just trying to get their needs met. And I think so many of our behaviors are a representation of that. Now, it doesn't mean people should just be able to do whatever they want. I think it's more an explanation than it is an excuse, right? But I think that's one of the most valuable lessons I've learned over the last however many years.
Yeah.
What would you say are some non-negotiable habits that people should do every single day in order to develop the self?
I think it's important to figure out what works best for you. So a lot of people probably would say meditation. I don't meditate anymore. I did for a long time, but exercise is meditation for me.
Mm.
That's how I feel about it. It all depends on what your core values are. Yeah, if you're somebody who values family, then you should probably have like 30 minutes of family night every night. Maybe you always want to have dinner at the kitchen table. I don't care about that at all. I want to eat on the couch and watch TV after a long 13, 14-hour day. So I think it all goes back to where we started. It really understanding what your core values are, because if you're living outside of alignment with your core values and your core beliefs, you're probably not going to be that fulfilled. It just is that way. I think that's just the way it's set up. We all know somebody who loves exercise and loves fitness. And when they don't do that, they're way grumpier and maybe they're way more short sighted. It's because that fulfills them. I mean, it also is good from a physiological standpoint, but it also fulfills them. I'm way more fulfilled when I go to the gym. I just am. This is a hard one to admit. I am I'm not saying I'm a bad person when we don't have money. I'm a better person when we have more money. I just am, because I'm able to think more abundantly and I'm able to think more long term, and I'm not worried about where my next meal is going to come from. It's really hard to operate from a place of scarcity. So I would probably dodge the question and say it really depends on what your core values and core beliefs are as a human, because me telling you to do something that I do is not going to matter unless you value it and the results that come. What are three things, or maybe it's one thing that you do every day? What's your non-negotiables?
Yeah, so like, I'm very similar. Like I make sure that I do some sort of physical activity every day. Like I usually have maybe one rest day, but I play part-time soccer for you, but part-time football. So I usually train every day. I read pretty much every day. And make contact with loved ones as well. Like it's something that I possibly don't do every day with every single one of them, but at some point, I'm lucky enough to work with my sister, for example. I talk to my mum and dad a lot, which I never really used to do, especially when I moved away. But I just keep those close connections going all the time, whether it's check-ins, exercise, and like I said, just focus on like my own path, but then also make sure I'm taking steps forward to a goal. Like for so long, I just kind of, once it was always the next step for me. It was like I spent a long time in education. I went to university, did an undergraduate, did a postgraduate, and it was kind of just like you were taking those steps that you were told to take. Like, that were told, like, oh, if you get this degree, if you get this master's degree, you'll get the next job and you'll get more money. And I was just kind of taking these steps and thinking it's taking a lot of energy from me, and I'm not. And what am I showing for it? And it got to a point where I realized that I wasn't taking steps for myself. Like I was just becoming a cog in a machine, and that was it. So for me, I'd probably say the third thing, aside from family and aside from looking after my health, would be to take steps to progress me, my career, my goals, my future. So those are the things that I would take seriously every single day, and make sure that, like you said, like the hardest thing is, and I can fully relate to what you said, to draw it back to what you said before, is consistency. Like obviously, we've just come after the Christmas period and things like that, and it's been quite hard. You had a few days off here and there, and it's the hardest thing is to get that consistency, but it's the most important thing. It's something I always say to a lot of people, because I work out a lot and things like that, and people always ask me and say, well, like, how do I get this body, or how do I lose a lot of weight? And people think that everything has to be perfect, that you have to have the perfect diet, that you have to have the perfect exercise, and it's not true. The thing I always say is the most important thing is just having that consistency. Whether it's 15-minute walk a day, or whether it's an hour gym session, if you do something, it's better than nothing. Whereas a lot of people tend to sort of, oh well, I feel a bit shit today, so I'm not going to go to the gym, but then I'm just going to sit in bed all day and eat crisps and watch TV. And it's like you're going from one extreme to the other. Why don't you just go for a half an hour walk on the days that you feel like that? You've still kept the consistency. It's just you've just lowered the level a little bit, so that in order for you to chase the next day properly. There's nothing worse than having a bad day and then it's like, well, I had a bad day yesterday and I've got to have a brilliant day today to make up for it. And it's like you end up with this backlog almost.
I feel like it's way harder to have 100% successful days than it is to have 100% negative days. It's like it's so, like you said, I've never had a perfect workout. I don't think it exists. I've never done a perfect podcast episode. I've never done a perfect speech. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. So I don't think I'm ever going to get 100%. But to your point, yeah, when you're feeling down, it's really easy to say, well, you know what? I'm already sick. I might as well just insert thing here. So I feel like, to your point, it's easier to move backwards than it is to move forward because there's far less resistance.
Yeah.
Right? It's if a 20% day is, I don't feel well, I'm going to walk for 15 minutes on the treadmill instead of exercising. Cool. A 20% bad day, like going in the opposite direction, is off the freaking rails. It's just very, very, very bad. So I couldn't agree with that anymore. But it's anytime we're going opposite resistance. So we're not facing resistance. We're going like with it. If you think of try to swimming against the current, even when you give 100%, you're not moving that far. Where if you just swim with the current, you're going to be cruising down the river. It's just the path of least resistance usually leads to the life we don't want, unfortunately.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I'd like to get your take on something, because like something I heard a while ago was someone said that giving up is easy, and we all know that giving up in the moment is easier. And I when I reflected on it, and when I came back to them, and we had a more elaborate discussion about it, I remembered all the times that, like, you know, everyone's given up at some point in their life on something, no matter what it is, whether it's career, familial things, or whatever it is. But I always found giving up really hard, and the reason it's really hard, it's easy in the moment, but over the long period of time, when you reflect on that, it's like we said before, because you've given up, you don't have the evidence to say that you can do hard things. So, you know, for example, if you go for a run and you give up on mile 8, and then, you know, you've got a marathon down the road, when you're doing that marathon and it gets really hard, if you can then refer back onto those times that you did give up, that's when it really will come back and bite you, like because you've not got that evidence that we talked about to rely on. Whereas if you try and not go with the flow and go with the current, as you say, in that moment, then when the hard times do come, which it comes for us all, that you do have that evidence there to lay back on. So I think that it is a massive misunderstanding. People think that giving up is easy. It's only easy in the moment. Long term, it's actually the hardest thing.
It comes back to bite you in the butt.
Exactly.
It's an emotional response that is overweighing the logical reasoning. And you wanted to do it from a logical standpoint, and then emotionally it got hard, and you said, well, this isn't for me. In the moment, it sucks. But you can suffer through that moment, and again, adjust accordingly. Maybe when you get to mile 8, I'm not running 8 miles, so I'm not talking trash to anybody running. But maybe you get to mile 8 and you do a light jog instead of the brisk run that you were doing. Or maybe you get to the point where you're walking. If you take your shoes off and you go home, you're going to remember that forever. You're going to remember that forever. And there's certain things that you can never put back in the box, is what I say. I try to say that all the time. I have this thing that I do with myself. It's going to sound terrible and dumb and stupid, but stick with me for a second. I have this thing where I say, what would the best version of Kevin do? I've never not done the thing. Here's why. Because if I don't do it one time, I can never do it again. It's useless now. It's absolutely useless if I don't do it that one time. I can never do it again, and I can never put that back in the box.
Yeah, because if you say, what would Kevin do, and but the last time Kevin gave up, then you're like, oh, you can't obviously use it.
A hypocrite. If I do that, I'm an absolute hypocrite. So I'm always trying to think of stuff like that, because, and when I say that, I'm not talking about anything crazy. I'll miss the wastebasket with a paper towel, and it goes behind it. The best version of Kev would go pick it up and put it in the trash. That's it. Like, what are we doing here? And every time I do that, it just reinforces. So I'm in the same boat as you. I think regret is something that comes after, and it hits you when you do or don't accomplish the thing that you hoped you accomplished. Pushing through is grit. Grit happens in the moment. Regret happens after. Regret happens eventually.
So obviously, it's fair to say that you've encountered a good amount of failure in your life. But what has failure taught you? How important is failure in the journey of self-development?
Failure, unfortunately, I didn't set it up this way, but failure seems to be where all the lessons are buried. Most of the lessons I have learned have come from me not knowing how to do the thing. If you knew how to do everything that had to get done in order to get to your goals, you'd already be there. You would just do them, and you do them faster and better, and then you just get the goal. That's the problem, is most of us just don't know yet, because it's hard. So I have found that, most of the lessons, and the lessons that I remember the most, and the ones that have been the most valuable to me, are the ones that I failed at the most, and I didn't want to fail at anymore. I would say that. Most of what I learned about money and sales was when I was broke and I couldn't pay my bills. And I just don't think that's a coincidence. I think oftentimes the lessons come from the necessities of failure. That's the biggest piece. And then the other thing too is you can rebuild your relationship with failure. I'm certain of that, 100%. You just have to fail at the appropriate constructive level. That's all. There's a big difference between me forgetting something on this podcast than if, say, I go give a speech in front of 15,000 people. Failing here is good. Like, let me fail forward. failing on stage in front of 15,000 people is drastically different. That might break my spirit. I might say, yeah, the speaking thing, I don't know. I don't think it's for me, right? There's levels to that. And it depends on, again, going back to it, depends on self-awareness and knowing yourself.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is how you fail as well. Like I used to have this coach when I used to play football as a kid, and he used to say, if you're going to be beaten, at least be beaten by someone else and not yourself. So like, there's a way to lose and there's a way to fail. Like make sure that it's due to external factors rather than the internal, rather than like you're saying about before, like we said about before, of giving up on mile 8 or giving up when the going gets tough or when it gets hard in life. Make sure that you can look yourself in the mirror and say, I failed because of something else there, but I can fix that next time by doing X, Y, or Z. But when you're obviously going through failure and obviously progressing through life, how do you stay motivated when things are quite slow? Like when you're not really getting the success, the daylight that you sort of see ahead of you? What do you do?
My relationship with this has changed a lot because in the beginning, I felt bad about me. I felt bad about myself. I internalized it. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. And honestly, some of those things, if you throw a yet at the end of them, I'm not good enough yet, I'm not smart enough yet, can become very productive in the long run. But I internalized it. It really affected my self-worth, which then put me into a spiral of maybe this isn't for me, maybe I'm never going to be successful, all of that stuff, where now it really is just, unfortunately, it's just par for the course. It's just par for the course. When you take 100 shots, if you succeed at 20 of them, you're doing pretty good. I mean, you're doing pretty good. Just you don't really ever see everybody else's failures. You really only see other people's successes. That's transparency doesn't really work any other way for most people. You only see someone when they become successful. I didn't know Taylor Swift when she was playing in front of 6 people in the middle of a cornfield. I didn't know who she was. I know her now when she sells out 90,000 person stadiums, but for most of her life, she wasn't doing that. How many times has she been booed off stage? We just don't see it. I just have a new understanding of that. And the other thought is when you work on yourself and you put in the reps and you practice and you practice and you practice, eventually a quote unquote failure is better than what an old quote unquote success used to be. And that's when you know you're really starting to make progress. My worst podcast episode today is so much better than my best episode 5 years ago. It just doesn't feel like it, Adam. It just doesn't feel like in the moment.
So what you're saying is a modern failure can sometimes become better than an old success. That's interesting. 100%. That's interesting. What do you sort of think about, obviously, if people are struggling with motivation? Because obviously what you were talking about there is sort of delayed gratification. That's basically what you were insinuating there. Can delayed gratification be taught to someone?
Yes, and not to the same degree, because it might go against your basic human needs and what you value. My business partner and I are really good examples. He doesn't care about today at all. Just doesn't care. It doesn't matter. I don't care. He's playing for 15, 20 years down the line. I am currently physically incapable of having a time perspective like that. So I need more wins on the day-to-day than he does. I think you can definitely learn it by practicing and then also figuring out, okay, well, I'm going to delay full gratification, but what are micro gratifications that I can get along the way? I think that's a big piece of it where, let's go back to the dieting example. If you diet and you crush it, and you exercise and you get down to your goal weight, and then you go eat a cake, that might not be beneficial for the goal. But if you get, I don't know, let's say you get a cheat meal once a week where you can eat over by X amount of calories, you're getting your needs met, but you're not getting all of the detriments that come with it.
Yeah.
So I think it just has to be set up where it's custom to the person. You're going to get sick of me saying that if you're not already. It's got to be custom to the person, because your ability to suffer is personal, and what you value as a human is personal. And then it's also like the conversation about, well, if you do withhold something for long enough, when you do get the thing, does that negate all the results you made? Like, we have to have that conversation too. So I think it can be taught, and I think it can be taught with many different tactics depending on the person.
Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for your support so far. However, YouTube is telling us that over 72% of you are yet unsubscribed to the channel. So if you can do us a massive favour and hit that subscribe button, it'll help this channel out massively and help us create content more in the future. Yeah, I listened to Alex Hormozy for years, and he says something about like designing the rules of the game in order to achieve those little micro progressions that you're talking about. So like, if you're not achieving the goals, that obviously these big goals that you have of like, oh, you know, by next year I want this, by year 2 I want this. He almost says like, rewrite the rules so that you're winning along the way, and then you're writing your own story, and eventually, though, by achieving those tiny micro progressions, they're still ultimately working towards those goals. But it just feels like a win, obviously, from the day to day, and obviously that's rooted in consistency.
Well, you're not going to win. You're not going to win the game this month, most likely. The game is longer. So the first word I always start with is sustainability. It has to be sustainable for you. If it's not sustainable for you, it doesn't matter. It just does. It can work really well for a week. It can work really well for a month. If it's not sustainable for you to run for a long period of time, it's just not the right tactic. The thing that you can do for the longest amount of time is most likely the thing that's going to end up being the most productive for you.
Yeah. Just to change topic slightly, obviously, like your background, you obviously struggled with things like mental health, and obviously you're going through these different stages, these different transitions of life. But obviously that is a wider issue in the world, especially, you know, as a Westerner, you can relate. But why do you think men are struggling with their mental health now more than ever?
I think that if we look at generationally, many of the masculine figures that men had in their lives were toxic. They just didn't realize it. I think that's a piece of it. Now, if you had an amazing role model father, I'm grateful to you and grateful for you. I've just met a lot of people who have very toxic parents in general, but oftentimes fathers. And then they start to adopt and adapt to those behaviors. And then they don't express themselves. They don't practice vulnerability because it was never okay to do that. So I think it's mostly our childhoods are really starting to catch up with us. And social media is not helping. Social media is making it way worse. In my gym, I'm in the top 1% of being in shape. On Instagram, I am nothing. I am a weakling, and people would eat me on Instagram. But in my gym, I'm like really good. We have access to all the 1% people on this little phone, on this little screen, and we can see everything that happens in the world. And I think it's messing with our minds because it's very hard to not compare to that. When it actually exists in reality, it's just not our reality. It's the reality of the world. I think that's a really big piece of it. And honestly, I just don't think there are that many role models out there. If I'm being very honest, I don't see a lot of men in the world that have what I value, but also have the humility that I value. I feel like everybody's kind of putting on a show. And that makes it really hard. It makes it really hard to figure out who you are as a man, and what does it mean to be vulnerable, and what does it mean to be masculine. Like that's a big topic today. Like, what does that mean? Well, it means something different to everybody. And I just don't think somebody screaming at me on social media knows what it's really like to be, what it means to be masculine. So I think it's a mixture. Childhood trauma that's just unrecognized and not worked on. Social media's comparison is making it very, very challenging. And I think as men, we get in our own head of, well, is it going to be weakness if I tell my partner what I'm dealing with, if I tell my friends what I'm dealing with, if I tell my family what I'm dealing with? Vulnerability is a requirement. And unfortunately, somebody has to go first when it comes to vulnerability. And vulnerability is hard as hell.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because obviously the way the world's going now, like I've read into it the last few years, and the way single parent households are becoming like almost the norm. Like in a few years, they think that will be the normal. Like to have obviously children growing up in single parent households, and unfortunately the statistics don't lie on, what happens to these children in terms of the vast majority of them. And then when, like you're saying, like just a few decades ago, before social media, children would grow up, especially as a young lad. I grew up just knowing my next door neighbours, knowing obviously my brothers, my uncles were close, and they were my role models. My dad was my hero. My dad was my role model. Whereas now, kids, for example, the average kid, especially in a few years, will be growing up without a dad. They'll be looking on social media. They'll be looking at the first people they see on that, and then it's kind of links back into what we were saying before of like there's such unrealistic standards. How is a 6-year-old supposed to going through his mind thinking, well, this is my new role model. I have to be like him as a 6-year-old. The sort of the gap is too big to sort of make up in such a short amount of time. And then obviously for me, the only thing I'd add on to it is probably the education system as well. I think education is working against, especially men. I feel like it's becoming so like sort of concentrated down avenues that don't interest young lads anymore, and that is not only shown in primary schools and high schools, it's also shown when people don't, especially men, don't pursue higher education because they're sick of it effectively, and they're wanting to you ask the average Chinese child what do you want to be when you're older. The answer is astronaut, engineer, lawyer, doctor. You ask the average American English young man, what do you want to be when you're older, and the answer is YouTuber, gamer, all. And that's not a coincidence. That's a lack of role models, for one, a lack of having parents around, and obviously social media playing a role in that, of they see these things and they almost think that is the only way that they can become successful. And yeah, it's almost like we're kidding them.
Do you think that'll change? Because isn't it, and again, this is I feel this very same, where people, I want to be an influencer. It's like, okay, I don't really know what that means. I mean, I do, but I don't know what that means and how you're going to accomplish that. Do you think that will change over time, since right now that's just the sexy kind of thing?
I definitely don't think we've seen the worst of it, because the way that the world has moved now, looking at just basic relationships and looking at the family sort of unit, the family unit in the Western world is falling apart, and that is what society was always built on. It was always built on prioritizing family, keeping, like the average person a few years ago in the UK had over 3 kids, 2-3 kids was the average. Now it's less than 1, it's less than 2, it's 1.4 or something, which is less than replacement. So I actually don't think we've seen the worst of it in terms of the generations are growing up with less children, and then there's less usually fathers in the home to raise these children. So I think that we're seeing the first sort of response to the negative effects of the family unit being broken, social media becoming so prominent. I think it's one of those things that the classic doctor sentence that it's got to get worse before it gets better. There's got to be sort of a shift back to, not necessarily going back to the old ages of having 10 kids per couple, which is obviously in today's society it's unrealistic just because of the cost of living. I mean, we can go down the rabbit hole with this, but because of the way feminism's going, and women have to work nowadays, was for a guy, I always say this on the podcast, for a guy who was working 50 years ago, you could have a guy that your average man who could be a builder, he could go to work, he could sustain a family off that wage, they could have a house, they could have 4 kids, and it would be completely doable. That is not possible in today's society. The average family unit, let's say, which isn't probably the average of today, but let's say you have a man, a wife, and then some kids. The wife now has to work as well in order to pay for the cost of living. Food prices going up, housing prices. I'm not sure what it's like in America, but in England it's ridiculous. So it's unsustainable to have that paradigm. So we've gone into the sort of the business realm of the world now, where everything is based around work. it used to be based around family and spending time with family because you didn't have social media. You had your family and you looked after your family. Whereas now it's a case of, oh, well, I want these video games and I want to, I want my business and I want all this money. And it's like, where is it going to lead? So I've kind of circumvented there, but to go back to the question, I think it will get worse before it gets better in that regard.
It's very clear that you are hyper passionate about that. It's abundantly clear, Adam, that is the thing that I'm guessing the reason you wanted to start this podcast in the first place is my guess.
Well, not necessarily the predominant reason. Obviously, the predominant reason is to just tell the truth, because I think that we've got, that's another thing, like we've got so far away from telling the truth. People are so afraid to just say things how it is, and I don't mean like you don't have to be rude when you say it, but people circumvent around the truth all the time, and they try and be nice about it, and sometimes people are just afraid to just say it how it is, and that is how it is in terms of what we're talking about there. That is the reality. Family isn't as important as it used to be for some reason, and I can't relate to that because I've come from a very strong family background where I have quite a few siblings, but then when I look at other people and think, well, why are they like that, and why do they have these viewpoints, and you talk to them and it's like, well, I've come from a broken family background, and people can't help that at the end of the day. But one thing that the world doesn't do, it doesn't shine a light and say, well, this is a problem. They try and say, well, it isn't a problem. Let's just react to it. Do you know what I mean? And I feel like the solution is more of a case of educating and saying, listen, your job isn't everything. Like you said yourself, like, your job isn't everything. You can have the nice car, you can have the nice house, you can have the nice watch, but if you don't have the most important thing, which is those close connections to you, it's meaningless. Like, you'll get to 50 years old and you'll think you'll be burned out and you'll have all this cool stuff, but it's like, what have I got to show for it if you've not got family there? Do you know?
I do. It's interesting because I'm not on the other side in terms of like a toxic way, but yeah, I was raised in a very strange family where family just isn't that important to me.
Yeah.
I'm not having kids on purpose, right? So I'm very much on the up, but I also, and this is the difference, not the difference. This is my perspective. I also understand that my way of living is not the way that everybody should live. I think I work a lot, more than most people should probably, but I don't think I'll get to the end of my life and regret it because I feel like I'm building something deeply meaningful that really matters to me, where I understand people that value family more than I do. It's like, you probably don't do what I'm doing. No, because you're not going to see your family and you're going to be freaking miserable. But it all goes back to the beginning of where this started, of what are your values, what are your beliefs, and what are your aspirations? Because if your aspirations are going to make you sacrifice your beliefs and your values, they're not the right aspirations. They're not. And I think this is why you see a lot of people sell their souls, for lack of better phrasing, because they lose their values and they lose their beliefs, but they get their aspirations. And it looks good on social media to have that new Ferrari.
Yeah, exactly. They think the money and the sort of external things will accustom for it. Do you think that you will ever change your mind on having a family?
I got a vasectomy, so I would have to go get reverse surgery, which I don't want to do it. Will we adopt in the future? I don't know. My thing was, I refuse to be a dad that's not there. I think it would be selfish of me to have a family just to have a family if I couldn't be the type of father that I needed. And until that's the case, I can't imagine it happening. And I can't imagine that happening for at least a decade, because growing this business is like the main thing. And it's not just because of the money. The money's good and lifestyle's good, but we have a really big mission that we're trying to accomplish. And I think that's going to require me to make more sacrifices than maybe somebody who isn't on the same mission.
Yeah. I already know your answer to the next question, because obviously it will differ on the type of person like you've alluded to a few times. But how would a person find their true purpose in life? Like, how would you direct them to go and find their own purpose?
I think you already know your purpose. I think all of us kind of already have an idea of what our purpose is. So I would sit down and I would look at patterns. So there's a bunch of different things you can do. What is something I would find you talking about on a Friday night with your friends? And like friends that you trust, not friends that are like, yeah, they're kind of my friends. We talk about surface level stuff. No, like the real stuff. What do you lose track of time when you're doing? Those are like base level questions. I think the question is throughout your life, what has given you the most pain that you wish you could take away from other people? What I think happens though is we get that answer and then we say, well, I could never find a way to make a living, or I could never provide for my family, or I can never make money. I think it's usually more a conversation of, I don't know what the vehicle is, but I do feel like I am somewhat connected to my purpose. My purpose is not to be a podcaster. My purpose is to be the type of person I needed when I was at my lowest point using my voice. If it wasn't podcasting, it would be something else. I'd learn to sing or something. I don't know. But when I was born, podcasting wasn't a thing. So I don't think I was destined to be a podcaster. I think the purpose has always been there. I've always wanted to help people. Always, always, always. I've always loved helping people. Then when I had my thing, I realized, okay, I really want to help people at a deep level. And then somebody interviewed me on a YouTube show. And I was like, whoa, imagine if you could do that for a living. Oh, you can. Boom. Vehicle kind of showed up there.
Yeah, you kind of took the words out of my mouth. You like obviously the goal was to help people, but then you used podcasting as the vehicle to get you there.
Yeah, I think it presents itself to you more than you find it. I think it's dangerous to wake up and say, I'm going to go find my purpose. Like, what an intimidating task. If we look at the patterns, how would somebody describe you? What would they say that you're really good at that you don't give yourself credit for? I think it's more a self-awareness thing than anything. And then it becomes a belief thing when you say, all right, cool. How do I deliver this wild thing to the world?
What do you think the biggest challenges are that face people from finding the purpose, or the biggest challenge that you find we're facing as a society?
Your purpose, unfortunately, might make you look and feel like a loser for a long time. It might not be the thing that's best financially. It might not be the thing that is supported by those around you the most. It's the thing that means the most to you that almost nobody else can feel. Now, you can do a really good job of building a community and letting people know why it's so important. But the fire has to burn brighter in you than it burns in anybody else. And I think living in your purpose is lonely as heck. I do. I think the results of it eventually can be great, but I do think the process of it is really challenging. We call it lonely land. Lonely land is when you go from just trying to fit in everywhere to just really leaning into, this is what I think I'm supposed to do in the world. And unfortunately, you can start to lose friends, you can start to lose family because you start setting boundaries. I think that's one of the hardest things is when you have a purpose, when you have extra necessity, when there's something that you feel is greater than you have to start setting boundaries for things that are no longer aligned.
Yeah.
And you're going to get pushback from the people who benefited from you not having boundaries in the first place. And that is one of the hardest things in the world. And I think it just takes a lot of time for your purpose to build into something externally meaningful. You'll probably be the most fulfilled you've ever been chasing your purpose. But maybe for the first 3 years, you're going to be the brokest you've ever been to. And it sucks. But you're fulfilled.
Yeah. I think that would be my answer to that. Yes, it's a great answer. I think a lot of things that people struggle with when they're trying to find purpose or trying to, try and sort of fulfill their dreams or aspirations is the pushback that they get from, the norms, like with a lack of a better phrase to put it, like a lot of the time you have to disassociate from things, whether it's habits, whether it's people or relationships especially. You get a lot of pushback from people. Like, I've had it myself when I've started doing this. Obviously, it takes up time, and you can't do as much as you could previously. And there's a lot of pushback where people say like, oh, you've changed or this and that, and sometimes that's sort of the sacrifice that you have to make in order to go to that sort of next step. But how do you sort of How do you sort of maintain those really important or maybe intimate relationships as you're trying to pursue your purpose?
I don't know if I have a great answer for this because I have a very small circle, and very transparently, the people who weren't on board with the mission are not in my life anymore. It just was, look, I don't think I'm going to even be able to do this. Never mind having people around me that don't think I can do this. I self-doubt myself enough. The last thing I need is other people in my life that self-doubt me. I don't know how I'm going to do this. So I think the best answer would be the relationships that I really want to cultivate are the ones that are the highest priority. And they're very, very, very high on the priority list. And the ones that I understand aren't as important are lower on the priority list, or I've just kind of let some float away because they became misaligned. A story about this. And this was one of the hardest things I ever did in my entire life. This was probably, 6 or 7 years ago. I was dating a young lady, and she said, "Hey, I want to meet your friends. I haven't met your friends yet." I was like, "Oh, yeah, cool. I'll introduce you to my friends." I had 2 friends in mind. I lived with one of them, and I had another buddy. The guy I lived with, I was like, he's like my big brother. He's going to be so interested in you. He's the best. Just a good man. You're going to love him. And I said, my other friend, and I had to pause. And I said, he's going to make fun of you the second you get there. He's going to make fun of me to you to try to get you to laugh along. He self-identifies as a dick. And I said, oh my goodness, imagine if somebody had to introduce me that way. That was the day I could never look at that person the same again. I can't. I am too aware, and I can't. I'm doing myself a disservice by allowing you to be in my life when you don't care about me like I care about you. That was one of the hardest things ever.
Yeah, you're kind of making excuses for him.
Yeah. Oh, it's the way he's always been. I understand. And who am I to tell him to change? But what I can do is sit down with someone and say, hey, look, your behavior is not in alignment with the person and the places I'm trying to get to. I want you there in the future. I do. But you got to do some work. If you want to do the work, awesome. If not, this isn't going to work. And it didn't work. That.
I think the unfortunate reality is you literally answered it in the first sentence. You said that usually it has to be a small circle. I read this book and it said when if you're trying to pursue big goals, etc. It said usually you only physically have time for 5 close people in your life, sort of the 5 friends. And it said, and then I don't know, it'd be interesting to get your take on this, but it's quite a controversial thing to say. But and I've found this to be true in my experience, is that if you have an intimate partner, that usually takes up 2 of them. So then you only have actually 3 close friends. And when I started doing the maths, I was like, do you know what? That's pretty accurate. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would agree. There's only so much time. There's only so much time. My business partner, I have 2 best friends. I know you're not really allowed to because you're only supposed to have 1, but one of my best friends is my business partner. I talk to him more than anybody on the planet. I talk to him every day. I mean, we're business partners. We've done 2,000 episodes together. We have a lot of conversation. I have another best friend who I see maybe 8 times a year. Maybe. He lives like an hour and a half away. I'll go down there and stay a night, hang with him. We text occasionally, not a ton. And then I see my wife every day. Outside of that, I very rarely see humans. We have some friends that we see every once in a while, but usually my wife is planning it. I'm not planning it. My circle is very, very, very intimate in terms of people I text and people I talk to regularly. Here's why that is beneficial. Because we also have 100 clients. We have a 17-person team, right? I have conversations going on all the time with people in the business realm and people in the professional realm and the podcast realm and the coaching realm, where at the end of the day, I don't really have the energy or the desire to spend time with people. I'm so exhausted at the end of the day. I want to go to bed. I just want to lay in bed with my wife and watch a show and then go to sleep. My weekends are usually just getting ready to survive the next week. I don't I don't want to go to a party. I don't really want to go to a cookout. I'm
No,
exhausted.
I fully understand that. I've got a little story on that. I remember like my brother was getting married, and it was quite it was quite a quick marriage. You know, from engagement to marriage was in 6 months, I think. And then they planned this small wedding, and when they were planning it, they only had like 50 people there, or 40 or 50 people. And his justification was, well, I just want the closest, smallest wedding. And a lot of my family had a lot of problems with that because a lot of people weren't invited. But whereas I had a completely different opinion, I was like, well, that's beautiful, because when you were at this wedding, everyone who was at the wedding you had seen within the last 6 months or the last year. You pretty much you see them all the time. Whereas what's the standard protocol when you go to a wedding? You see people you're not seeing in 5-6 years, and it's like, oh, how the last time I seen you were in high school and you're now in university. And I just thought, like, I think that's a beautiful thing. Like, that's probably something that I would personally do, and it's something that is extrapolated into this conversation of, like, I much prefer having close connections and having a small group rather than trying to maintain a large group, using all the energy in the world and not having those super close sort of connections. But just to sort of go on with that, like, what's the most important lessons you've learned about that sort of love or connection with those close individuals?
My favorite people in the world are the people that know they don't need me. Those are like my favorite. Not that I don't want to feel valued, not that I don't want to feel significant, but my favorite people in the world are the ones that want what's best for me regardless of themselves. Even and especially if that means that they see me less. Because I'm the same way. Adam, if you email me two years from today, I'll respond. I don't care if you ask me for something a year from today. I'll respond. I don't care about how much quality. I don't care much about how much time we spend together. I care about the quality of the relationship.
Yeah. Quality over quantity.
Yeah. And it's not always directly connected to the time. So I value people that just understand that I want to do my thing. And me wanting to do my thing does not mean I don't want to see you. It doesn't mean I don't care about you. It doesn't mean I don't love you. It means that I'm really dedicated to this thing. And I just really appreciate the permission that people give. There's something to that. I think there's some people that don't care whether you win or lose. They just don't care. It's like, whatever. If Adam makes it, he makes it. If not, no worries. There's some people that want to see you lose. They went to high school. They went to university with you. You said one thing one time in class, and they're like, nope, I hope you never win. There's people that want to see you win, and then there's people that want to see you win regardless of them. I think that fourth bucket is just very rare, and understandably, because I think you can only have so many of those people actually in your life, because you're not going to see them often, and it's not going to be a quality time relationship. But that's something I've learned. And then I would say the other thing is the true people that should be in your life come closer as you start to be more authentically you. When you're being more authentically you, people are shaming you for that, honestly, they're not here for the authentic you. They were here for the version of you that served them the most. And that is one of the hardest things ever of all time, because it makes it feel like growing is bad. When if you didn't grow, you might be taken advantage of by these people forever. You just wouldn't know it was happening.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you said before, like we alluded to before, in terms of, when you are sort of on that path, if you feel that resistance from people, they're holding you back in a negative light sometimes, and they don't want to see you change too much. Just some quick fire questions just to wrap it up. So, what's the worst piece of advice you've ever been given?
Raise your prices. You don't charge enough. You should essentially be running business for free.
Interesting. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Two things. One, big things start small, and understand the power of compounding, not just from a math perspective, but from a potential perspective as well.
Can you just elaborate on that last one?
Yeah. So, man, my business partner is a math genius, electrical and computer engineer, loves numbers. He's the numbers guy. Kev, we just have to focus on getting a little bit better every day. That's it. 1% of 1% every day. So if you want to read 10 pages, read 11 pages. You get a little bit better, a little bit better. It's not going to seem like it does almost anything. And it's not for like the first 5 years. But when we get 10 years in, things are going to be wild. We're 8 years in and it's really starting to pay off. And now I'm really able to see how many things have compounded over the last 8 years. So yeah, that.
Brilliant. And then finally, what is the meaning of life?
Whew. Oh, you save that one for last, huh? What is the meaning of life? I think there's two thoughts. One is to make sure that you do not pass on the traumas, triggers, and pains that you experience. You do not pass those on to somebody else. You figure out how to work through those so that does not have to exist in your bloodline or your circle. That's one. And I think the purpose of life is to see what you're capable of. None of us are getting out of here alive. I don't know what happens when we die. I have no idea. I hope I come back as an evolved version of me. We'll see. I'll see you in the afterlife. We'll see what happens. So we might as well make the most of the time that we have here, as wisdom, weird, and fortune cookie as that might seem. I think that's kind of the purpose. Take a shot, see what happens. And maybe if we end up back on this rock again, we get to take a second shot from a better standpoint.
I love that. Well, Kevin, it's been great to talk to you. You're very experienced at this, and obviously there's loads of wisdom that you are shining through to your own audience, and then obviously you're reflecting that through ours as well. So I can't thank you enough. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and comment on the video. Let us know your thoughts. As well, on your way out the door, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down here. It'll help this channel out massively. Thank you.